Beneath the glittering chandeliers of London's grandest ballroom, laughter drifted like perfume through the air, sweet at first breath and bitter upon reflection. Silk skirts whispered across polished floors. Crystal glasses chimed politely. Conversations swelled and receded like a tide composed entirely of manners. And yet, amid this orchestrated elegance, cruelty moved freely, disguised as civility and sharpened by curiosity. Miss Eliza Harrow stood near a column of white marble, her gloved hands folded with studied composure before her. She had chosen the corner not from shyness but from wisdom. Corners granted protection. They allowed a lady to observe without becoming the subject of observation. Tonight, however, observation hunted her relentlessly. Her gown, once a soft lilac, had faded into a color that refused to name itself. The lace at her sleeves had been repaired with such care that only a patient eye would notice. Unfortunately, society's eyes were always patient when searching for flaws. She felt their glances like threads tugging at her dignity, pulling gently, persistently, until she feared the entire garment of her composure might unravel. "She is the one whose father lost everything in that dreadful shipping venture," murmured a woman behind a feathered fan. "And the sister married well, did she not?" "Escaped just in time," another replied. Eliza kept her chin lifted, as though the air above the whispers were somehow cleaner. She had long ago learned that humiliation was best endured with posture. If one must be pitied, one should at least be pitied beautifully. Across the room, couples revolved in graceful patterns. Violins coaxed the air into romance. Candlelight gilded every smile with warmth that Eliza could not quite feel. Once she had danced in such rooms without dread coiling in her stomach. Once invitations had arrived without hesitation. Now, her presence was tolerated as a courtesy to old acquaintance rather than welcomed as a delight. A young gentleman approached her with hesitant politeness. Mr. Pembroke had called upon her twice in the previous month, his interest cautious but promising. He bowed stiffly. "Miss Harrow," he said, eyes flickering briefly toward the surrounding listeners, "I regret that I must beg your pardon for any misunderstandings." She understood before he continued. Her smile arrived precisely on time, though her heart stumbled behind it. "My circumstances, you see, make it impossible for me to pursue attachments that lack practical foundation." "Of course," she replied gently. "Practicality is a virtue much admired." He nodded with visible relief and withdrew, leaving behind a silence far louder than the music. The nearby ladies did not pretend not to hear. They did not need to. The rejection had been performed for them. Eliza's breath felt suddenly shallow. The ballroom, moments ago vast, now pressed inward like a tightening fist. She inclined her head to no one in particular and moved toward the terrace doors, each step measured, unhurried, dignified. If she must retreat, she would retreat beautifully as well. Cool night air greeted her like a confidant. The gardens beyond lay silvered under moonlight, their stillness a balm against the room's relentless scrutiny. She gripped the stone balustrade and allowed herself a single, trembling exhale. "You endured that with remarkable grace." The voice came from behind her, low and composed, neither intrusive nor apologetic. She turned. He stood partially in shadow, tall, impeccably dressed in black evening coat and waistcoat embroidered so subtly it might have been mistaken for shadow itself. His posture was relaxed, yet there was an unmistakable authority in the way he occupied space, as though the world adjusted itself around him rather than the reverse. She recognized him at once. Everyone did. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensshire. He had not been dancing. He had not been laughing. He had been watching. "I did nothing extraordinary, Your Grace," Eliza replied, her voice steady though her pulse betrayed her. "I merely stood still." Standing still while the world attempts to push you aside is no small accomplishment. She did not know how to answer that. His gaze was not pitying. It was assessing, thoughtful, unsettlingly attentive. "I observed," he continued, "that you possess a talent most rare in society." "And what talent is that?" "You do not crumble when given every reason to do so." A strange warmth stirred in her chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Compliments from strangers often carried hidden intentions. From a duke they carried consequences. "I suspect, Your Grace, that endurance is less a talent and more a necessity." He stepped closer into the moonlight. His features were sharply cut, handsome in a way that discouraged frivolity. His eyes, dark and discerning, studied her as though she were a question he intended to solve. "Necessity," he repeated softly. "Yes. I find myself in need of precisely that quality." She frowned slightly. "I do not understand." "I require a wife," he said calmly, as though remarking upon the weather. Temporarily. The word hung between them, incomprehensible. I beg your pardon? A wife in name only. For appearances. For the silencing of certain political inconveniences and familial disputes. Nothing more. Her fingers tightened against the stone. The garden seemed suddenly unreal, like a painted backdrop behind an absurd performance. You cannot be serious. I am never anything else. She searched his expression for mockery and found none. Only deliberation. There would be no affection, he added, his tone precise. No expectations beyond civility. You would reside at my estate, attend necessary functions, and present the image of marital stability. In return, your reputation would be restored beyond question, and your future secured. It was madness. It was insult. It was salvation. Why me? She asked quietly. Because you have already demonstrated that you can withstand society's cruelty without surrendering your dignity. And because you have nothing to gain from deceiving me. The honesty of it struck her harder than flattery ever could. A carriage rolled faintly along the distant drive, wheels crunching against gravel like the ticking of an unseen clock. I depart within minutes, he said. If you wish to accept, you may do so now. If not, I shall never trouble you again. He extended his gloved hand toward her, patient, unwavering, offering not romance but rescue wrapped in audacity. Eliza stared at that hand, knowing that taking it would alter the course of her life in ways she could neither predict nor refuse to imagine. Morning unfolded over the ancestral seat of the Ravensshire estate like a curtain lifting upon a stage Eliza had never rehearsed for. Pale light filtered through towering windows, revealing ceilings painted with mythic figures who appeared to watch her progress with knowing detachment. Servants moved quietly along corridors, their deference so complete it felt like a language she did not yet understand. Everywhere she turned, portraits of solemn ancestors observed her with oil-rendered judgment, as though the walls themselves questioned how a woman of diminished fortune had crossed their threshold as mistress. Her chambers overlooked gardens arranged with mathematical precision. Hedges trimmed into disciplined shapes bordered gravel paths that led to fountains murmuring in patient continuity. Beauty here was not wild, it was commanded. Eliza stood at the window in a borrowed silk robe, feeling less like a duchess than an intruder dressed for a masquerade that had already begun without her consent. A maid entered bearing gowns of astonishing craftsmanship. Fabric spilled across the bed in a cascade of sapphire, ivory, and rose. His Grace instructed that these be prepared for your Grace's inspection, the girl said with respectful calm. Eliza touched the material as though it might vanish. She had not owned such finery even in her family's most prosperous years. Yet the gifts unsettled her. They were generous without warmth, precise without tenderness. They spoke of provision, not affection. She was escorted to breakfast in a dining hall so long that conversation at one end would arrive politely delayed at the other. The Duke sat at the far head, already composed, reading correspondence beside untouched tea. He rose when she entered, bowing slightly with impeccable courtesy. Good morning, Duchess. The title landed gently and heavily at once. Good morning, Your Grace. They ate in measured quiet, discussing the day's schedule as though they had rehearsed domesticity for years. A luncheon with neighboring landowners. A brief appearance in the village. An evening reception. Their dialogue was courteous, efficient, almost scholarly in its restraint. Yet beneath it ran an undercurrent Eliza could not name, a silent awareness that this civility was an elaborate performance sustained by mutual will. Before she departed to dress, he placed a small velvet case beside her plate. A necessary emblem, he said. Inside lay an antique brooch bearing the Ravensshire crest, its gemstones dark and dignified rather than ostentatious. It belonged to my mother, he added. Its presence upon you will quiet certain inquiries. Eliza fastened it at her collar with careful fingers. The weight of it felt like legitimacy pinned directly to her pulse. The village visit passed in a blur of bows and curtsies. People who would once have regarded her with passing politeness now greeted her with reverence. She saw curiosity in their eyes but also acceptance. The Duke remained near without hovering, allowing her space to speak, to smile, to inhabit the role he had assigned her. At the luncheon, however, civility thinned. Lady Ashbourne, renowned for her sharp tongue disguised as wit, examined Eliza with a smile too precise to be kind. How fortunate, she remarked lightly, that His Grace possesses such charitable inclinations. A quiet hush settled over the table. Eliza felt the familiar sting of public diminishment rise like heat beneath her skin. Before she could answer, the Duke set down his glass with deliberate calm. Charity implies imbalance, Lady Ashbourne, he said smoothly. I assure you my wife stands beside me by choice, not by favor. He turned to Eliza then, and without hesitation lifted her gloved hand to his lips. The gesture was brief, controlled, devastatingly intimate. Gasps fluttered around the table like startled birds. You will address the Duchess with the respect you reserve for me, he finished. The remainder of the meal unfolded under a new atmosphere entirely. Conversation resumed, but it bent subtly around Eliza as though acknowledging a newly discovered gravity. She felt something shift inside her, a fragile thread of dignity tightening into strength. That evening, she wandered into a secluded portion of the gardens, seeking air unperfumed by scrutiny. Rain began without warning, soft at first, then insistent. She turned back toward the house only to find the Duke approaching across the path. You will be drenched, he observed. I have endured worse inconveniences, she replied. Without ceremony, he removed his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was warm from his body, heavy with a closeness she had not anticipated. They stood beneath a stone archway while rain drummed steadily around them, the world reduced to the rhythm of falling water. Neither spoke for several moments. This arrangement, she said at last, requires a great deal of pretending. Yes, he agreed quietly. And yet, Your Grace, you do not behave as though I am merely an arrangement. His gaze lingered on her with unsettling honesty. Perhaps I find pretense less tolerable than I expected. The admission hovered between them, fragile and dangerous. A servant approached distantly with an umbrella, breaking the moment before it could deepen into something neither had agreed to permit. They returned indoors without further words, but Eliza carried the warmth of his coat with her long after it was removed. Later, alone in her chamber, she noticed another object placed upon her writing desk, a small iron key attached to a ribbon. A note lay beneath it in the Duke's precise hand. The West Garden remains unobserved by visitors. I thought you might value a place where you need not perform. Eliza closed her fingers around the key, realizing that each gift he offered was not ornamental but thoughtful in ways that unsettled her carefully built defenses. He was not merely protecting her reputation. He was quietly observing her needs. And that awareness frightened her more than Lady Ashbourne's cruelty ever could. For the first time since accepting his proposal, Eliza wondered whether the Duke's single condition, no attachment, had already begun to dissolve in the silent spaces between their words. Thunder pressed against the windows of Ravensshire estate like an impatient visitor, and the corridors answered with hollow echoes that made the house feel cavernous and alert. Eliza stood near the library hearth, watching flames fold and unfold upon themselves, seeking distraction in their predictable movement. The storm had gathered without warning, trapping her indoors with a restlessness she could not politely name. The door opened without ceremony. The Duke entered, coat damp at the shoulders, hair darkened by rain. He paused upon seeing her, as though surprised by the intimacy of finding her alone in the quietest room of his home. I did not expect company, he said, removing his gloves with deliberate calm. Nor I, she replied. The storm appears determined to rearrange our intentions. A faint smile touched his mouth before vanishing. He approached the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth, and for several moments they shared only the sound of crackling wood and distant thunder. The silence between them had changed in recent days. It no longer felt formal. It felt charged like air before lightning. Your Grace, she began carefully, this arrangement grows increasingly difficult to remember. He did not feign misunderstanding. Because it no longer resembles an arrangement. She met his eyes, startled by the ease of his admission. You set a condition. I did. And yet you place coats upon my shoulders, keys into my hands, and defend me as though the matter were personal. His gaze lowered briefly, not in shame but in contemplation. I did not anticipate the consequences of proximity. The honesty in his voice unsettled her composure more than distance ever had. She stepped closer to the hearth, drawn by warmth that was no longer solely from the fire. I wonder, she said softly, whether you required a wife, or merely someone who would not abandon you when society pressed too closely. He studied her with an intensity that felt less like scrutiny and more like recognition. I required protection from my title from a cousin eager to claim it through scandal. A married duke invites fewer questions than a solitary one. And now, he said, I find the questions have changed. A sharp knock sounded against the door, shattering the fragile stillness. A servant entered with visible unease and delivered a sealed letter. The Duke broke the wax, scanning the contents with tightening expression. My cousin has begun circulating rumors, he said quietly, that you are a paid impostor, that our marriage is theatrical. Eliza felt the word strike like cold water. Shame rose instinctively, though she had done nothing wrong. Then I should leave, she said at once, before your name is dragged further into ridicule. His head lifted sharply. You mistake me, madam. It is not my name I fear losing. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither dared complete. Thunder rolled again, closer now, as though urging confession from the walls themselves. They stood only inches apart, breath mingling in the firelit air, both aware that a single step would undo the careful boundaries they had sworn to uphold. Neither moved. Neither spoke. And yet everything between them had already changed beyond recall. Carriages arrived in a glittering procession before the ancestral facade of Ravensshire estate, their wheels grinding softly over gravel like a prelude to judgment. Lanterns lined the sweeping drive, casting golden halos upon guests whose laughter rang too brightly to be innocent. Inside, chandeliers blazed with theatrical brilliance, illuminating a ballroom prepared not merely for celebration, but for reckoning. Eliza descended the staircase on the Duke's arm, her steps measured, her expression serene by careful design. The Ravensshire brooch rested at her collar, its weight a reminder that she stood here not by accident, but by decision. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crowd as they entered, curiosity sharpened by weeks of rumor and speculation. She felt the scrutiny press against her like heat, yet she did not falter. The Duke's posture was composed, but she sensed a restrained intensity in the way his arm remained firmly supportive beneath her hand. He was not escorting her as a courtesy. He was standing beside her as an ally. Music began. Conversation swelled. Wine flowed. And beneath the elegance, tension threaded itself invisibly through every exchange. It happened sooner than expected. A voice cut cleanly through the atmosphere, smooth and resonant with deliberate confidence. Your Grace, might I request a moment of clarification before the evening proceeds too far into delight? The crowd parted subtly as the Duke's cousin stepped forward, impeccably dressed, smiling with the assurance of a man who believed himself armed with truth. His bow was shallow, his eyes sharp. I trust, the cousin continued, that the lady presented as Duchess can provide some account of her family lineage, for the sake of those who value transparency in matters of inheritance. Silence fell with suffocating precision. Conversations died mid-breath. Every gaze shifted to Eliza. She felt the old humiliation rise, the familiar instinct to shrink, to apologize for existing where she was not welcome. But before she could speak, the Duke released her arm and stepped forward, placing himself between her and the accusation. You presume much, he said calmly. I seek only clarity, the cousin replied. Rumors persist that this marriage is theatrical in nature. The insult hung like smoke. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears, yet she held her head high, refusing to offer the spectacle of wounded pride. She would not grant them that satisfaction. The Duke turned slowly, addressing not his cousin but the entire assembly. His voice carried without strain, rich and controlled, commanding attention without effort. My wife's worth is not measured by coin, nor by gossip whispered behind fans. She stands beside me because I chose her for qualities no inheritance could purchase. A murmur stirred, uncertain, wavering. He reached for her hand, drawing her forward into the open space at the center of the ballroom. The gesture was not protective now. It was declarative. You question her legitimacy, he continued. Then observe where my allegiance rests. With deliberate care, he removed the signet ring from his finger, the ancient emblem of Ravensshire engraved deep into gold worn smooth by generations. Without hesitation, he slid it onto Eliza's gloved hand. Gasps broke across the room like glass shattering. If proof is required, he said, his gaze fixed steadily upon his cousin, let this suffice. I do not lend my name lightly, nor my loyalty at all. The cousin's composure faltered for the first time. The crowd shifted perceptibly, sympathy tilting, whispers recalibrating. What had been scandal moments before now transformed into admiration for a devotion too bold to be dismissed as pretense. Eliza felt tears threaten, not from shame, but from the overwhelming force of being defended so publicly, so fiercely. The room that had once symbolized judgment now witnessed her restoration. The cousin attempted a final protest, but it dissolved beneath the weight of collective opinion already turning against him. With a stiff bow, he retreated into the crowd, diminished. Music resumed hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Conversation followed, lighter, relieved, as though a storm had passed and left the air clearer than before. The Duke turned to her then, and the intensity in his expression had shed all pretense. "I find," he said quietly for her alone, "that I am no longer capable of pretending." Her breath caught. "This arrangement began as necessity," he continued, his voice lower now, vulnerable beneath its steadiness. "But somewhere between defending your honor and observing your courage, I ceased to remember the difference between obligation and desire." She searched his face, seeing no calculation, no restraint, only sincerity stripped of pride. "You are free," he said. "Free to leave this as an arrangement fulfilled, or to remain as my wife in truth. The choice at last is entirely yours." The ballroom blurred at the edges of her vision as emotion rose like a tide she could not command. For the first time since accepting his proposal, she was not being offered protection, nor position, nor security. She was being offered himself. And in the charged stillness that followed, with 100 eyes pretending not to watch, Eliza realized that her answer would not only decide her future, but his as well. That if you like my content, don't forget to subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and share your thoughts in the comments.